Maya woke up in the dark bunker to the sound of alarms. The red emergency lights flickered across the concrete walls, casting everything in a crimson glow. She had been sleeping at her desk again, surrounded by papers and old computer monitors that barely functioned. Her neck was stiff and her eyes felt heavy, but the adrenaline rushed through her body as she jolted awake. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. She ran to the main operations room where her team was already gathering. 6 people stood around the central table, all of them with the same expression of dread on their faces. Lucas was there, his thin frame hunched over a radio receiver. Christine stood next to him, her jaw clenched tight. The others were Marcus, Yuki, Sandra, and David. They were all that remained of the Colorado resistance cell. An alarm had been triggered outside. One of their perimeter sensors had detected movement. Someone or something was out there in the mountains. Maya checked the monitors and saw the data streaming across the screens. Heat signatures. Multiple heat signatures. And they were moving fast. David, who had been a military specialist before the invasion, immediately analyzed the patterns. He said the signatures looked too large to be human. They were too organized, too deliberate. The formation suggested intelligent beings, not animals. Marcus began calculating the distance and speed. They were coming down the mountain directly toward the bunker. Maya's mind raced through the possibilities. The Zarthians could have followed one of their scouts back to this location. Or perhaps they had finally upgraded their thermal scanning technology enough to detect the heat emanating from the bunker. The Zarthians had conquered hundreds of worlds. They understood surveillance and tracking better than any species in the galaxy. She made a decision immediately. They had a protocol for this situation. Protocol 7. Everyone knew what Protocol 7 meant. They had to abandon the bunker and scatter into the wilderness. They had to leave behind all the equipment they had spent months gathering. They had to leave behind the only safe place they had left. Christine asked if they should try to fight. She said they had weapons. She said they could set traps in the tunnels. Maya shook her head. Fighting in the bunker would trap them inside. If they were overwhelmed, they would have nowhere to run. Their only chance was to disappear into the mountains where the Zarthians would have trouble pursuing them in the darkness. Lucas began destroying the most important files. He fed papers into an old furnace one by one, watching them burn. Maya grabbed the backup hard drives containing years of research about Zarthian technology and weak points in their systems. Those drives had to survive. They were too important to lose. The heat signatures were getting closer. 5 kilometers away now. 4 kilometers. 3. The Zarthians moved quickly through the mountains, faster than normal humans could move. But they were also heavy, their massive armored bodies weighing them down. Yuki and Sandra prepared the emergency packs. They always kept supplies ready for situations like this: food, water, medical kits, ammunition, and basic tools. Each person grabbed a pack and slung it over their shoulders. They were leaving their home with only the clothes on their backs and whatever they could carry. David went to the back exit and checked the passage that led up into the mountain caves. He came back and gave a thumbs up. The exit was clear. They could make it out before the Zarthians reached the bunker entrance. But Marcus wanted to know how the aliens had found them. They had been so careful. They had covered their heat signature with insulation. They had used only cold water for their needs. They had limited their time on radios. How could the Zarthians possibly have located them? There was no time to answer. The heat signatures were now just 1 kilometer away. Maya gave the order to move. They ran through the bunker corridors, leaving behind the computers and the maps and the photographs they had taken of the night sky. They left behind the memory of civilization as it had existed before the invasion. The passage up into the mountain was narrow and dark. They used small flashlights to navigate, but they kept the lights dim. One of the Zarthian abilities was thermal vision that worked in total darkness. Any excess heat could give away their position. They climbed carefully, trying not to make noise, trying not to disturb any loose rocks that could fall and alert the enemy below. Behind them, they heard the sound of the bunker entrance being forced open. The Zarthians were inside. They were searching the main operations room, discovering the burning furnace and the abandoned equipment. Maya wondered how long it would take them to realize that the humans had escaped. The team continued climbing upward. The mountain was cold and the air was thin. Sandra coughed softly and tried to suppress the sound. Christine grabbed her arm and pulled her upward faster. They had to get to the higher caves where the Zarthians would have more difficulty following. An hour later, they reached the first safe cave, a deep cavern hidden behind a waterfall. They stopped there to catch their breath. Everyone was gasping and sweating despite the cold. Their legs ached and their lungs burned, but they were alive. They had escaped the bunker just in time. Lucas looked back down the mountain and saw lights flickering in the darkness below. The Zarthians were searching the lower caves using bright lights to illuminate the passages. But they would eventually give up. They would return to their ships and prepare the next strategy. And the humans would have to find a new place to hide. Maya sat down on a rock and felt the weight of everything pressing down on her shoulders. They had lost their base of operations. All their equipment was gone. All their records were destroyed or in danger of being discovered. But they were still alive. They still had the hard drives with the Zarthian research. And they still had hope. David approached her and said they needed to make a plan. They needed to figure out their next move. They could not stay in these caves forever. They needed to find other resistance cells and join forces. They needed to organize. They needed to strike back at the aliens with something bigger than simple survival. Maya nodded slowly. She knew David was right. But right now, in this moment, she just wanted to rest. She wanted to close her eyes and forget about the enemy that was hunting them. She wanted to pretend that the world had not changed. She wanted to pretend that Earth was still theirs. But when she opened her eyes again, she saw the determined faces of her team looking at her. They were waiting for her to tell them what to do next. They were looking to her for guidance and hope. And Maya knew that she had to find the strength to keep going. She had to become the leader they needed. She told them they would rest here for 6 hours. Then they would move deeper into the mountains and head north toward the Wyoming territories, where there were rumors of other human resistance groups. They would regroup and plan their next attack. They would show the Zarthians that humanity was not finished. Not yet, not ever. 3 days of hiking through the mountains brought Maya and her team to a valley they had never seen before. The landscape was harsh and beautiful, with tall peaks surrounding them on all sides and a river cutting through the middle. They moved quietly through the forest, always watching for signs of Zarthian patrols or surveillance drones, but so far they had seen nothing. Either the Zarthians did not care about this remote area, or they were too busy dealing with other resistance groups to send search parties this far north. As the sun began to set on the 3rd day, Christine spotted smoke rising from behind a rock outcrop about 2 kilometers away. Everyone stopped immediately. Smoke meant fire, fire meant people, and people could be either friends or enemies. There was no way to know without investigating. Marcus wanted to approach with caution. He suggested they scout the area first, make sure it was not a Zarthian trap. The aliens were smart enough to use bait to lure humans into ambushes. They had read about this tactic in the pre-invasion military records, but Yuki disagreed. She said if there were other humans surviving out here, they needed to find them. They needed to make contact with other resistance cells. They needed to build an army if they ever wanted to have any chance against the Zarthians. Hiding forever was not survival. It was just slow death. Maya made the decision to approach, but carefully. They would leave their packs hidden in the forest and approach with minimal weapons. If it was a trap, they could run faster without the extra weight. David and Christine would stay back at a distance where they could provide covering fire if needed. The others would move forward to make contact. As they got closer, Maya could see the source of the smoke more clearly. It was a small camp with several tents made from camouflaged materials. There were people moving around the camp, and they all appeared to be human. She counted at least 20 people, maybe more. This was a real resistance cell, and it was much larger than her team. A woman stepped forward from the camp before they could fully emerge from the forest. She was tall and muscular, with dark skin and short black hair. She wore military clothes that looked salvaged from various sources, stitched together in a patchwork of different colors. She held a rifle loosely in her hands, but her posture suggested she was not immediately hostile. The woman introduced herself as General Monroe. She said she was leading the Northern Alliance, a coalition of resistance groups spread across the Rocky Mountains. She had been tracking rumors of a survival team in Colorado and had sent out scouts looking for them. She wanted to know if Maya's team was that survival team. Maya stepped forward and explained who they were and what they had been doing. She told Monroe about the research they had conducted on Zarthian technology. She told her about the patterns they had discovered in the alien ship movements. She told her about the weakness that existed in their defensive systems. General Monroe listened carefully to everything Maya said. Her dark eyes showed sharp intelligence and genuine interest. When Maya finished, Monroe invited them to come to the camp. She said they had food and shelter. She said they had been waiting for people like them to arrive. The war was about to change, she said. The resistance was finally ready to go on the offensive. That night, sitting around a fire in the mountain camp, Maya learned more about the Northern Alliance. Monroe had gathered fighters from all across the western United States. She had soldiers, engineers, pilots, and scientists. She had supplies that had been hidden before the invasion in secret bunkers. She had plans. Real plans. Not just the desperate schemes of desperate people trying to survive one more day. Monroe showed Maya maps of Zarthian positions across North America. The aliens had established a main command center in what used to be Denver, Colorado. They had orbital platforms above major cities. They had mining operations in areas with valuable resources, and they had been so focused on controlling population centers that they had largely ignored the remote mountain areas. This was their advantage. The Zarthians thought the mountains were useless. They thought no threat could come from wilderness and snow and isolation. They were wrong. The mountains were the perfect place to hide an army. The mountains were the perfect place to plan a war. Monroe had been assembling a force of experienced pilots. She had found 3 old fighter jets similar to the ones Maya had learned to fly. She had also discovered 2 Apache helicopters hidden in a military depot north of Billings. But she did not have experienced pilots to fly them. This was where Maya came in. Maya was hesitant at first. She had flown those old jets, but she had never flown in combat situations with her life depending on her skills. She had no formal pilot training, just the remembered knowledge from a course she had taken years ago. She said she was not qualified for what Monroe was asking. But Christine stepped forward and volunteered immediately. She said she had military training. She said she could be Monroe's lead pilot. She said she would fly whatever General Monroe needed her to fly. Lucas also volunteered. He said he had studied aircraft maintenance and could help keep the planes flying. General Monroe nodded with satisfaction. She said they had the beginning of an air force now. With trained pilots, they could strike at Zarthian supply lines and communication centers. They could damage the enemy's infrastructure. They could make the invasion of Earth costly in ways the Zarthians had not anticipated. Over the next few days, Maya was introduced to the other leaders of the Northern Alliance. There was Captain Thompson, who controlled a group of explosives specialists. There was Dr. Helen, a scientist who had been researching Zarthian biology and physiology. There was Engineer Park, who had salvaged and repaired countless weapons and vehicles. Each of them brought unique skills and knowledge to the Alliance. Monroe held a planning meeting with all the senior leaders in Maya's team. She spread out maps on a table and pointed to specific locations. She outlined a strategy that involved coordinated attacks on multiple Zarthian targets. She called it Operation Sunrise. The idea was to strike at the alien infrastructure across North America simultaneously, overwhelming their ability to respond. The first target would be a Zarthian supply depot west of the mountains. If they could destroy the supplies stored there, they would force the enemy to redirect resources and leave other areas vulnerable. The second target would be a communications relay station. If they could take that down, they would blind the aliens for several hours, maybe longer. Maya listened to the plan and felt something she had not felt in months. Hope. Real hope. Not the desperate kind that came from mere survival, but genuine belief that they could actually hurt the enemy. They could actually win. But as the meeting continued, she also realized something else. This was no longer just about survival. This was war, real war, and wars meant casualties. Wars meant that some of the people in this room might not survive to see the outcome. General Monroe seemed to read her thoughts. She looked directly at Maya and said that they all knew the risks. They all knew that many of them would die, but they also knew that doing nothing meant certain death. At least this way they had a chance to fight back. At least this way they could die fighting for something that mattered. Maya thought about Earth. She thought about the billions of people who had already died in the invasion. She thought about the cities that had been destroyed. She thought about a future where Zarthians ruled the planet and humans were either extinct or enslaved. She stood up and told General Monroe that she was in. She would help organize the air operations. She would help plan the strikes. She would help lead the Northern Alliance into battle. They were going to show the Zarthians that humanity would not go quietly into the night. 2 weeks of intense preparation followed. The Northern Alliance camp transformed into a military installation. People worked constantly, preparing weapons and vehicles, checking supplies and training fighters. The old jets were brought to a hidden airfield in a valley surrounded by tall mountains, where the Zarthians would have difficulty spotting them from orbit. Engineers worked around the clock to make sure the planes were flight-ready. Christine became obsessed with the jets. She spent every waking hour in the hangar, checking every bolt, every fuel line, every weapon system. She talked to Engineer Park constantly about possible modifications and improvements. Christine wanted to make sure that when the moment came, the planes would fly perfectly. She did not want any failures caused by mechanical problems. The failure would have to come from the Zarthians being too strong, not from her equipment letting her down. Lucas worked alongside Christine, learning every system of the aircraft. He became fascinated by the old technology. These planes had been built decades ago, before computers controlled everything. They were simple in design, but complex in execution. A pilot had to understand the machine completely to fly it well. Lucas began to understand why Christine was so dedicated to perfecting every detail. Maya spent her time with General Monroe, studying maps and planning the attack routes. They had to figure out the best approach to each target. They had to calculate flight times and fuel consumption. They had to identify where the Zarthians had placed their defensive weapons. One mistake could mean the loss of the entire Air Force. Monroe showed Maya a detailed analysis of Zarthian defensive positions. The aliens had placed anti-aircraft guns around all their major installations. They had fighter ships on standby at 3 separate bases. They had orbital platforms that could rain down fire from above. The task seemed impossible, but Monroe believed it was possible if they planned correctly. The key, Monroe explained, was surprise and speed. If they moved fast enough, they could strike the targets before the Zarthians could coordinate a response. The aliens relied on technology and communication. If communication could be disrupted, if the enemy was caught off guard, human ingenuity might overcome superior firepower. Maya studied the supply depot location carefully. It was built into a canyon system about 200 kilometers west of the mountains. Surveillance showed that the Zarthians thought the canyon walls would protect them from aerial attack. They were wrong. If the jets came in low through the canyon, using the terrain for cover, they could reach the depot before the Zarthians knew they were coming. Dr. Helen joined the planning sessions to provide information about Zarthian biology and behavior. She had discovered that the alien vision was optimized for certain wavelengths of light. At dawn and dusk, their vision was not as acute. This was when the attack should happen. At dusk, when the Zarthians were switching from day shift to night shift, when their guard would be lowest. Over the 2 weeks, other fighters began to arrive at the camp. News of the Alliance had spread through the underground resistance network. People came from destroyed cities and hidden bunkers across the country. Some brought weapons, some brought information, some simply came to be part of something larger than their own survival. Among these arrivals was a woman named Victoria. She was a trained Apache helicopter pilot who had been hiding in the ruins of Utah. When she heard that the Northern Alliance was gathering experienced pilots, she made the dangerous journey through Zarthian-controlled territory to join them. She told stories of hiding in the mountains for months, watching Zarthian patrols fly past without detecting her. She was thin and scarred, but her eyes burned with determination. Victoria immediately formed a partnership with Christine. They would fly the 2 Apache helicopters together, providing close air support for the ground teams. Victoria would handle the main helicopter, and Christine would pilot the second one. Together, they would be unstoppable. Or at least they hoped they would be. Sandra took over the training of the ground forces. She had military experience from before the invasion, and she was ruthless in her demands. She made the fighters run, through drills repeatedly until they could execute complex maneuvers perfectly. She taught them how to use the terrain for cover. She taught them how to move silently through the darkness. She taught them that hesitation meant death. Marcus worked on logistics, making sure that every fighter would have the supplies they needed: food, water, ammunition, medical kits. He calculated carrying capacity and movement speeds. He created schedules and backup plans. If the operation was going to succeed, every person needed to know exactly where they needed to be and when they needed to be there. Yuki worked with the explosives specialists, preparing charges and detonators. They had salvaged materials from old construction sites and had begun manufacturing explosives in a hidden laboratory inside the mountains. It was dangerous work. Mistakes would be fatal, but Yuki had a steady hand and a sharp mind. She checked every batch of explosives personally before they were certified as safe to use. David took charge of communications. He worked with salvaged radio equipment to establish secure networks between the different teams. He created codes and protocols to ensure that the Zarthians would not be able to intercept their messages and understand what was happening. It was primitive by pre-invasion standards, but it was the best they could do with what they had. As the weeks passed, the different groups began to work together as one unified force. The Northern Alliance was becoming an actual army, not a large army by traditional standards, but a real military organization with structure and discipline and a clear mission. On the night before the final preparations began, General Monroe gathered everyone around the fire. She gave a speech about what they were about to do. She told them that they were about to strike a blow against an enemy that had seemed invincible. She told them that they were proving that even though the Zarthians had superior technology, humans had something the aliens could never fully understand. Humans had desperation. Humans had nothing left to lose. She told them that some of them would not survive the coming operation. She told them to look around at the person next to them and understand that person might be gone by the next sunrise. But she also told them that they had to accept this risk, because refusing to fight meant allowing the Zarthians to take everything. Fighting meant they had a chance. Fighting meant their names would be remembered. Maya stood in the firelight and looked at the faces of the people around her. She saw fear and determination in equal measure. She saw people who had lost everything but were still willing to stand against an enemy that seemed unbeatable. She saw her team members, Christine and Lucas, sitting close together, holding hands. She thought about how far they had come since the invasion began. From hiding in a bunker to leading a real military operation. It seemed impossible. But then again, everything seemed impossible these days. The next morning, the equipment was loaded and ready. The jets were fueled, the helicopters were armed, the ground teams had their weapons and supplies. General Monroe gave the final order. The operation would begin at dusk the following day. Operation Sunrise was about to commence. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. Maya sat in the cockpit of the lead fighter jet, checking systems one more time before takeoff. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. This was the moment everything had been building toward. This was the moment they would find out if all their planning and preparation meant anything. Christine was in the second jet, running through her own pre-flight checklist. Victoria and her co-pilot were in the Apache helicopters, armed and ready. On the ground, Sandra and her teams were moving into position around the supply depot 300 kilometers away. Everything was synchronized. Everything depended on perfect timing. Lucas's voice crackled over the radio. He was in the control room, monitoring all communications. He gave Maya the final go-ahead. It was time. Maya pushed the throttles forward and felt the jet surge down the runway. The acceleration pressed her back into the seat. The wheels lifted off the ground and the earth fell away beneath her. The old jet climbed into the sky, defying gravity through a combination of fuel and metal and human determination. Christine's voice came through the radio confirming that her jet was also airborne. Victoria reported that the helicopters were ready. All forces were moving to their designated positions. The attack had begun. They flew low through the mountain valleys using the terrain to stay hidden from Zarthian sensors. Maya felt her fighter respond to every movement of the control stick. The plane was old, but it was strong. It was honest. It did what you asked it to do without pretense or deception. As they approached the target zone, Lucas began feeding them updates. 3 Zarthian patrol ships had been spotted in the area, but they were moving away from the depot. The supply depot itself showed minimal activity. The Zarthians believed their canyon location made them safe from aerial attack. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The canyon appeared ahead, a deep gash in the landscape with towering walls on both sides. Maya pushed the jet down, descending toward the canyon floor. She had to be careful not to clip the walls. One mistake would send her and the jet crashing into solid rock. But she was focused. She had trained for this. Her hands and feet moved automatically, making tiny adjustments to keep the jet centered in the canyon. Behind her, Christine followed in the second jet, maintaining the same altitude and speed. The two jets moved in perfect formation, like dancers performing a choreographed routine. Below them, they could see the Zarthian supply depot, storage buildings and fuel tanks and radar installations scattered across a small plateau. The Zarthians saw them at the last second. Alarms must have started blaring in the control centers, but there was no time for the aliens to organize a response. Maya released the first batch of missiles. They streaked down toward the fuel tanks. The impact was immediate and devastating. The first fuel tank erupted in a massive fireball. The explosion was so powerful that the shockwave rocked Maya's jet, nearly sending it off course. But she recovered, pulling up hard and banking left to avoid the debris. Christine released her missiles next. More explosions. More fires. The depot was becoming an inferno. Storage buildings were collapsing. Zarthian soldiers were running in panic, unsure where the attack was coming from or how to defend against it. But the Zarthians did have defenses. Anti-aircraft guns began firing, sending tracer rounds up into the sky. Maya pushed her jet into a hard turn, evading the incoming fire. A round passed so close she could hear the snap as it cut through the air near her canopy. Her oxygen supply alarm suddenly went off. One of the rounds had damaged something. She reported the damage to Lucas. He told her to get out of the area immediately. She had enough fuel to make it back to base. She needed to go now. Maya climbed higher, pulling the jet out of the canyon. Christine was right behind her, also escaping the anti-aircraft fire. Below them, the supply depot was largely destroyed. The ground team would move in soon to confirm the damage and collect intelligence, but they still had a second target. The communications relay station lay another 100 kilometers to the north. They circled around, heading toward it. Lucas was monitoring the Zarthian response. So far, the aliens seemed confused. They did not know where the attacks were coming from or how many jets they were facing. The element of surprise was still with them. The communications relay station sat on an open plain, its antenna tower rising high into the sky. The Zarthians had fewer defenses here. They had believed this location was too remote to face any threat. As the two jets approached, they encountered only light anti-aircraft fire. The Zarthians were still unprepared. Christine's jet struck first, firing missiles directly into the base of the antenna tower. The tower collapsed, twisted metal crashing to the ground. The building housing the communications equipment took damage from the secondary explosions. Electronic systems inside began to fail. Maya finished the job, targeting the backup generators and power systems. When her missiles hit, the entire station went dark. No more communications. No more coordination between Zarthian forces. It would take them at least several hours to restore their communications network. Those hours were crucial. The helicopters had been waiting for the communication station to be destroyed. Now Victoria and her team moved in to provide close air support for the ground teams that were moving into position around both target areas. The Apaches used their cannons and missiles to suppress Zarthian defensive positions, allowing human soldiers to advance and secure the damaged facilities. Maya and Christine headed home, the damaged oxygen system still troubling them. It was not critical yet, but it was deteriorating. Maya pushed the jet faster, burning through fuel at an accelerated rate to increase their speed. They had to get back to base before the oxygen system failed completely. As they flew back toward the mountains, Lucas gave them the initial damage assessment. The supply depot had been destroyed. At least 80% of the Zarthian supplies in that area were gone. The communications relay was offline. It might be weeks before the aliens could fully restore their communications network in that region. But the victory came with a cost. Sandra reported that 3 ground soldiers had been killed and 9 wounded. One of the ground teams had been caught in a Zarthian counterattack. The wounded were being treated, but some of them were serious injuries. The victory was real, but it had come with blood. Maya thought about those soldiers as she flew home. They had given their lives for the resistance. They had died so that others could fight. It was the nature of war. But knowing that did not make it any easier to accept. The jets landed at the hidden airfield as darkness fell completely. Maya climbed out of the cockpit on unsteady legs. Her entire body was shaking from the adrenaline crash. She had flown a combat mission. She had fired weapons at an enemy. She had helped destroy Zarthian facilities. General Monroe was waiting for her on the runway. The general embraced Maya, holding her tight for a long moment. When she pulled back, there were tears running down her face. She said that they had done it. They had struck a real blow against the invasion. They had proven that the Zarthians could be hurt. Christine emerged from her jet and collapsed onto the tarmac, exhausted but alive. Lucas ran to her and helped her up. Victoria landed the first helicopter and gave a whoop of triumph as she climbed out of the cockpit. They had won. They had actually won. Operation Sunrise had been successful. The morning after the successful strike, the entire Northern Alliance gathered in the main camp. Word had spread through the underground resistance network faster than anyone expected. Humans from hiding places across North America had heard that the Zarthians could be defeated. The message traveled through secret channels and encrypted radio broadcasts. Resistance groups in Canada and Mexico were responding. Fighters were mobilizing. Hope was spreading like wildfire. General Monroe stood before the assembled fighters and gave a speech that echoed through the mountains. She told them that they had proven something vital. They had proven that human ingenuity and courage could overcome alien technology and superior firepower. The Zarthians were not invincible. They could be beaten. And if they could be beaten in Colorado and Wyoming, they could be beaten everywhere. More importantly, she explained, Operation Sunrise had disrupted the enemy's supply lines and communications. Zarthian forces across North America would face resource shortages in the coming weeks. Their coordination would suffer due to the damaged communications network. The aliens would be forced to respond defensively rather than continuing their occupation efforts. This was the window of opportunity the resistance had been waiting for. Over the next 3 days, reports came in from other resistance cells across the continent. A group in Arizona had destroyed a Zarthian fuel depot. A group in New Mexico had attacked a mining operation. A group in Texas had sabotaged an alien supply convoy. The resistance was rising up everywhere, inspired by the success in the mountains. Humanity was no longer hiding and dying. Humanity was fighting back. But with success came new responsibilities. General Monroe began receiving requests for support from other resistance groups. They wanted ammunition, weapons, medical supplies, and air support. The Northern Alliance was becoming the center of a larger resistance network. They were becoming the true leadership of the human fight against the aliens. Maya found herself promoted to lieutenant colonel and placed in charge of all air operations for the expanded network. It was a position she had not sought, but one she could not refuse. There were no other qualified pilots available. The responsibility fell to her. She began training new pilots immediately. Every resistance group that had access to old military aircraft wanted trained pilots. Maya worked with Engineer Park to identify and salvage jets from hidden military bases and museums. They found 2 more fighter jets near an abandoned Air Force base in Nebraska. They found 3 transport planes that could be converted into cargo vessels for delivering supplies to isolated resistance groups. Christine became Maya's deputy. Together they built a real air force from the salvaged remains of humanity's military past. It was not a large air force by pre-invasion standards, but it was growing every week. With each new pilot trained and each new aircraft repaired, the resistance became stronger. But the Zarthians were not idle. They began responding to the resistance attacks with overwhelming force. They sent larger patrols through the mountains. They increased the number of surveillance drones scanning for human activity. They established new military installations specifically designed to suppress resistance movements. One night, Lucas burst into Maya's tent with urgent news. He had intercepted a Zarthian radio transmission. The aliens were planning a major offensive against the Northern Alliance. They had identified the location of the main camp. They were sending a fleet of attack ships to destroy it. They would arrive in 3 days. General Monroe called an emergency war council. All the senior leaders gathered to determine their response. They could not defeat a Zarthian fleet with their current forces. The helicopters and jets could not match alien fighters in open combat. They needed a different strategy. It was David who had the idea. He suggested that they evacuate the camp and scatter into smaller groups. They would hide their people and equipment across multiple secure locations. When the Zarthians arrived, they would find an empty camp. Then the Resistance could conduct mobile operations, striking at targets of opportunity rather than defending a fixed location. The only problem was that it would take at least 2 days to fully evacuate everything. They might not have that much time. Zarthian movements were unpredictable. The fleet might arrive early. Maya made a decision. She would take some of the jets and create a diversion. She would fly toward Zarthian positions on the eastern edge of their territory. She would make noise and attack smaller targets. She would draw the alien attention away from the mountains long enough for the evacuation to complete. Christine immediately volunteered to go with her. So did Victoria. They would take all available jets and helicopters. They would hit Zarthian supply lines and communication stations. They would force the aliens to deal with them rather than attacking the camp. General Monroe tried to argue against it. She said it was too dangerous. She said they could not afford to lose their best pilots. But Maya explained that it was the only way. The evacuation had to succeed. The Resistance had to survive. If losing a few pilots meant saving the entire Northern Alliance, it was worth the price. They spent the next day preparing the jets for the most dangerous mission yet. Equipment was loaded into cargo planes. Supplies were packed into helicopters. Every available pilot was briefed on the mission parameters. They would fly east, staying low to avoid Zarthian radar. They would attack a series of targets meant to draw enemy attention. Then they would extract and return home as quickly as possible. As the sun rose on the day of the mission, Maya sat in her jet's cockpit and thought about everything that had happened. A few weeks ago, she had been hiding in a bunker, watching the world end. Now she was leading military operations against an alien invasion. The change seemed impossible, but impossible had become normal for all of them. She pushed the throttles forward and felt the familiar surge of acceleration. The jet lifted off the runway and climbed toward the sky. Behind her, 6 more jets and 2 helicopters followed in formation. They were a small force, but they were her force. They were human pilots flying human machines, defying an enemy that had conquered worlds. As they flew east, Lucas's voice came through the radio. He reported that the evacuation was proceeding on schedule. The camp was being broken down systematically. Equipment was being loaded into vehicles. The Resistance was disappearing like smoke before the wind. Maya led her flight toward the first target, a Zarthian mining operation in Colorado. The aliens had never expected an attack this far from the mountains. Security was light. The defenses were minimal. Within minutes, the mining operation was destroyed, blazing pillars of smoke rising into the sky. Then they moved to the next target. And the next. Each strike was quick and precise. Each target was chosen specifically to draw enemy attention. Reports came in of Zarthian fighters scrambling to respond. The aliens were confused. They did not know where the next attack would come from. They were dividing their forces, sending ships in multiple directions. But some of those ships were turning toward the mountains. The evacuation was running out of time. Maya made the decision to pull back. They had done enough. They had created enough confusion. Now they had to get home and help with the final stages of the evacuation. The flight back to base was tense. They were pushing their jets to maximum speed, knowing that Zarthian fighters might be closing in behind them. But they made it back to the hidden airfield just as the last supply trucks were pulling out of the main camp. General Monroe was waiting for them as they landed. She embraced each pilot, thanking them for giving the evacuation time to succeed. Every piece of equipment had been removed. Every important file had been salvaged. The Resistance had been broken apart and scattered, but it had survived. As night fell, the Northern Alliance was completely distributed. Small groups of fighters were hidden across the mountains and forests. The supply depots were relocated to secure caches in multiple locations. The communication systems were set up to operate independently, unable to be tracked by destroying any single facility. General Monroe gathered the remaining people at the new forward command post and gave them a final message. She told them that the Zarthians had tried to destroy them, but they had failed. The Resistance was no longer a single target that could be eliminated. They were like water, flowing around obstacles, adapting to the terrain, always moving forward. The war for Earth had entered a new phase. The Resistance had proven they could strike at the invaders effectively. They had proven they could survive despite overwhelming odds, and now they were ready for a much larger conflict. Maya stood under the stars and looked at the faces of her team. Christine, Lucas, Victoria, Sandra, Marcus, Yuki, David. They had come so far from that day in the bunker when the alarms had started blaring. They had survived. They had fought. They had won. But she knew this was just the beginning. The real war was still ahead of them. The Zarthians would respond with greater force. The aliens would adapt their tactics. The battles would become harder and more costly. But for the first time since the invasion began, Maya believed that humanity had a real chance of winning. They had the will to fight. They had the courage to resist. And as long as humans were alive and willing to defend their world, the Zarthians could never completely win.